Welcome to Breaking Sales. A quick announcement. Please make a note. Beginning April 1st, we're adjusting our podcast schedule to 2 episodes per month rather than 4. Mark on your calendar, we will release the first and third Mondays of every month. This will enable us to deliver even more valuable content in each episode with top expert guests and more specific takeaway points to help you and your business grow. Be sure to subscribe and don't miss out. You've just asked a prospect a meaningful question. One of those questions that took you several minutes to muster up the confidence and courage to ask. But even as you asked the question, you still heard that little voice of doubt trying to hold you back. You weren't immune to its final whisper. Are you sure you want to ask this? Don't mess this up. Nonetheless, you went for it. With your uncertainty pounding away and your conviction hanging on a thread, your prospect responds with silence. 5 seconds have gone by and it feels like all is lost. You did mess up. So you jump in quickly and you offer your thoughts instead of allowing the prospect to answer. The result? In the short term, you made yourself feel better by breaking the silence and gaining back some false security and control. In the long term, you lost the opportunity to listen and learn about what the prospect in that very moment was truly thinking. I get it. I may have intensified this experience, but let's be honest, this example isn't too far off. So the question becomes, how do you and how should you handle silence in a conversation? Today, Pam and I are exploring why giving someone space to think is crucial to your success. You'll learn how to overcome the instinct to fill the silence, why thoughtful pauses improve the quality of the information that you share, and practical techniques for making silence a powerful tool in building trust and poise during your conversations. Let's get going. Pam, what I'd like to talk about today, and I like the way you describe it, I'll say silence and let silence in a conversation permeate, but I also like the way you describe it, which is give someone space to think. And so the reason why it came up is, as you know, right, our listeners know, we do a lot of film study and we do a lot of deal breakdowns and listening to prospect conversations and all that with our clients. And so I can think of 2 examples just in the past week and a half where there was one in particular. This decision maker had just said, "We need your help," on a first call with our client, someone that we coach. And then there was silence. I don't know, maybe 5-7 seconds. And then that same decision maker started to say something. And I don't know what the word was because someone from our client's team jumped in right away and started to describe how they would help.
Happens a lot, I think.
And it was just that moment that it was just so obvious. And even the individual that we coach heard it and felt it, which is, we will never know, ever, and that was my comment, we will never know what was on that decision maker's mind. We do not get that moment back. And we didn't. I listened to the rest of the call. So, you went from, "We need your help," which is what a lot of sales professionals really would like to hear as much as possible, to about 5 to 7 seconds of silence, which wasn't that much. Then you could hear the prospect coming in to say something again, and boom, interrupted, sales team took over. And again, the key thing is that prospect had a thought. They were still in a thought process and they were about to share that next thought. And no one's ever going to know what that next thought was.
Filled the space. We filled the space. So the way I too, though, Dan, think it's important for our listeners to remember the concepts in which we coach are also rooted in it's our job to ask questions that facilitate critical thinking on the part of the prospect. And I always like to say, if we're doing this right and we're peeling back the onion, we probably are asking a lot of questions that they haven't necessarily thought through. And I completely agree with you that we ask these questions and instead of allowing space, we start maybe like, well, do you think it might be this? Or do you think it might be this? Or do you think it might be this? I try very, very hard, even in my coaching, just to allow silence to permeate so that people have an opportunity to think. I had a prospect probably about 6 months ago, and I was very open. We were talking about the potential need for her sales team to be coached. And her particular line of business, we don't have a single client in, nor do I have any working knowledge of their business. So I asked her, I said, what are your thoughts on how the fact that I have no coaching clients in your business and I don't have any understanding of your business, how might that affect the way your people perceive coaching from me? And she sat there for a minute and I said, I understand. You haven't spent a lot of time organizationally talking about that in your hunt for a sales coach. And she said, we've spent no time talking about that, potentially the qualifiers for what we would want. And I said, well, just take a couple minutes and think about how that might affect my ability to coach them. And I got to tell you, Dan, it was a long period of silence. And I tried to make her very comfortable, take a couple notes, gather your thoughts. And she said, I am going to need a couple of minutes. I really haven't thought about it. And I didn't want her to give just some knee-jerk reaction. And I even told her that. I said, don't give me the first thing that comes to mind. Just take a couple minutes and really think through it. That was probably one of the more key components of our conversation when it came to how and if we could potentially help them. And so we started talking through the pros of me not understanding their business nor having a client, and the cons of me not understanding their business nor having a client. And even within that dynamic, there were plenty of times where she would then say, give me another second to think through this for a minute. Give me another second to think through this for a minute. I'm also starting to understand in some of these conversations as the conversations are progressing more towards, does this make sense to do and does it make sense to do with us? Allow for more time. Understand that if we are going to be asking these questions to help them get it right, I'm still seeing a lot of, 30-minute meetings, 45-minute meetings, and the ball's moving down the field. They're getting closer and closer to realizing if a decision makes any sense at all. And what I'm finding, Dan, is there's still so many sales professionals, probably me included, that are trying to shortcut the amount of time some of these meetings are going to take because of the fact we're going to be asking questions they haven't thought through. And we want to be in the room when they're thinking through it. We want to be okay sitting there for a few minutes and letting them think through it, debate it in their own head. Versus, you can get back to me on that one. I used to do that all the time. You know what, Dan? You can get back to me on that one. You can get back to me on that one. Maybe we talk about that one later. So that's another component I'm learning about myself is I've got to be better at understanding that I need to allow for more time. They're not going to have immediate answers to these questions. And I also want to be in the room as they're thinking through these. I don't want to be able to say, get back to me on that.
So if you remember, that's a really cool story. And I like the way you handled that. And I do like the way you used the pause, the silence, the blank space as a really good opportunity for you and her to connect on some truth. Like you gave her permission And it was a powerful mechanism in your conversation that was very helpful.
Very powerful, and probably one of really the key points that they had to work through.
Yeah. So as you were talking for our listeners, I think about, right, the the art of asking questions. And Pam, you and I have talked about this so many times, right? Where asking the question is logical, but receiving the question is emotional. And I think our listeners have to remember that when you ask a question, and even though you've mapped it in your head and you know it's a powerful and you know it's a good question, it's easy for you. It's a lot more logical to ask it. But the recipient, it's emotional because in their mind, the first things that we all think about is, am I going to be judged in my answer? Why is this person asking me this? What are they going to do with my answer? Where are they trying to take me? That's almost instinctual. And we've discussed that in past podcasts. So giving someone space is really important too, because you have to understand the person receiving the question still trying to figure out the intent of the question for a few seconds before they even go sometimes to thinking through, what is my answer? And so I think we have to respect that too, especially when you're asking really good questions, like you said, where you know your role is not to ask questions to get that person somewhere. Your role is to ask questions to allow that person, what you said, critical thinking.
And I think it works for us too. If we are really in the moment, we're hearing their responses to our question. We know we have to continue to peel back that onion. I also am now trying to teach myself. Dan answers one of my questions. Let me think for a moment or two so I can come up with the next question that I know will allow them to go a layer deeper. And Dan, sometimes I find, you listeners know me, I'm not that smart. It takes me a second to sit back and say, okay, I heard your answer. I know there's another question here. Give me a second. Give me a second to formulate my words around what I want to find out about what you just said. So I even find myself needing to slow down when I hear somebody's answer in order to ask a good next question that allows them to expand even further. That takes me 30 seconds or so to just say, "Oh, all right, hold on for a second. Let me think through how I want to ask my next question based on what you just shared." So I think it goes both ways. We've got to learn to be okay sitting there for a minute in the silence so we can do a good job of formulating the words that matter and asking the next question.
100%. It reminds me of this one experience I had that I will share, and I'll never forget it. It's probably happened 12 years ago, maybe 13 years ago. So I'm talking to this big company, and it's me and two other folks in the room. I don't know what their titles were. It's 13 years ago, right? But I know they ran sales and they ran development. It was something like that. we had we're coming up on 45 minutes, and it was a 45-minute meeting, right? And they had done a lot of talking, and I did a lot of learning, and I did share a few things. But the long and the short, it's at the end of the meeting, I remember I thinking to myself, I'm not too sure how this has gone yet. And that's what I was thinking. I I I, I feel like they did some good thinking, but I'm not too sure they shared everything. I feel like I shared some appropriate expertise, but I'm not quite sure it connected. It was kind of one of those meetings. So at the end, I just said, hey, we've talked for 45 minutes. I know it's about time to wrap up. Did anything stand out today? Did anything resonate? And then I didn't say anything. And Pam, that's why I still remember this. It had to have been at least 30 seconds that nobody said a word. And I remember thinking to myself, do I say something now? No, you gotta let it go. Should I repeat the question? Maybe they didn't understand it, right? I remember having that self-talk in my head going, okay, where are we going with this? And I don't know how many seconds passed by. It might have been 40 at that point. I don't know. But what was really cool is they actually shared things in that moment that were very relevant that I had no idea they were thinking. No idea. And so to this day, I still look back on that experience and go, if you would have interrupted them, there's a strong likelihood you would never have found those few things out because they weren't in your notes. You had never talked about it with them or them with you. And you would have missed that opportunity if you would have jumped in to fill the void of the silence. And that's like one of my favorite experiences that I've had of just letting someone have space to think how and what they want to share.
So you prompted me to also think about maybe there's different types of situations where you have to be aware that people are going to need more time in order to answer your question. There's a couple I thought of while you were talking. Number one, when you know you're going to be asking a question where you're going to ask that prospect to think through how others may be thinking about the particular situation. So, hey, we're having some issues with our current service provider. These are the things that we're experiencing. How many others in your organization might agree with your perspective? Who do you think might have a different perspective on that? And what might that be? Take a minute. So I also think there's certain questions where you have to be aware. These are they're going to be the kind of questions that I have to set up to say, this one's going to probably take you a couple of minutes to think through. And then the other situation,
I really like that. I like that. Yeah. I think that's a great strategy.
well, and if you remember too, the other one that I think you and I both do a good job of paying attention to is when you have a lot of people in the room and it might be awkward to have them share in front of each other what they're feeling or what's on their mind. You and I, during COVID, we presented to a group of folks via Zoom. And if you recall, there was 4 of them. At the end of our presentation, they said, this has been great, wonderful. Like, thank you so much. This was eye-opening. And you said, appreciate the feedback and the kind things that you're saying. But how did this conversation help you gain clarity on whether or not our firm potentially could be the right firm? And if you recall, one of the women on the end looked a little uncomfortable. It was very clear on the Zoom that she was just a little uncomfortable. And you said, folks, it's okay. You can share whatever is on your mind. It is absolutely okay that we talk about what may apply and what may not apply based on what you just shared. And she said, okay, I think we're a little bit too much product driven, where some of the things that you talked about today, I'm having a hard time connecting whether our folks are going to be able to do this and if it's appropriate to do it. And you said, how about everybody just think through that for a minute and share whether or not that's a perception that's a real one for all of you. And I find that that situation too, where people are like, okay, there's 4 of us. Am I really going to say what's on my mind? Just giving some space. Give some space. Yeah.
One of the things that I still do enjoy those meetings where there's 3, 4, or 5 people. It's almost like a cool challenge. Can you engage each one? Can you get each one to feel like they can be honest no matter what they have to say? Those are often my favorites. But what I was going to add here too, and I do it, So we talk about giving space to the prospect or the client. Very important. But we can take space, like you said too, Pam, and we can take space all the time by saying, let me think that through. Let me check my notes. Hold on. I want to make sure I capture what you just said. There's all kinds of things that we are fully allowed to do in those conversations to give ourselves some space so we can catch up with what we're hearing and what we want to ask or maybe say next.
And to your point, listeners, to demonstrate to somebody that you're truly listening in a conversation, you have to be able to give feedback. Okay, Dan, let me take a second and summarize everything that you just shared in that 2 minutes. Lay it out there. Did I get that right? That takes me a minute when I have to say, okay, let me process that. I want to be able to spit right back at you what you just shared to make sure I heard you correctly. That absolutely takes me a minute to say, all right, how am I going to give this feedback? I want to make sure I heard them. That takes time.
It does. So for our listeners, many of you know this phrase that I'm going to share. What Pam and I are describing here is absolutely a part of what we would call executive poise. I mean, the ability to allow space for someone to think, the ability to communicate, permission for them to have space so that they can think, and then the ability for us to vocalize that we need a little bit of that to think. That absolutely isn't a characteristic, a practice of someone who is or has executive poise in that meeting.
And that's something that you have to practice.
Yes.
It's not automatic.
And I will share this for our listeners because those who follow us and those who get coached by us and all that, some of them know what I'm going to say. There's many mindsets that can help with this, but the one in particular, I'll pause. I will give our listeners a little space for about 2 seconds to think. The mindset that helps this. Don't label what you're experiencing, hearing, or observing good or bad. If you can learn to do that, it is so much easier to understand the importance of giving space.
Neutrality means I have to give space.
Yeah, exactly. As we wrap up, I want you to think about how you can use some deliberate silence moving forward in your conversations. That's right. How can you use silence to your advantage? Can you use it to intensify and leverage important insights after a thoughtful pause? Or use it to signify your effort and thoughtfulness as you digest what you're hearing? Or maybe even to make sure that you are creating appropriate space for your prospect to reflect and think with honesty. Practice sitting with silence in your next conversation, whether prospects, teammates, or loved ones. Give others the space to think deeply and see what you will discover.